crucial step towards challenging imperialism and gaining full citizenship. But it is also more than this, because as with Césaire, we get again a clearer vision of her idea of liberation when we are attentive to the temporality that she expresses. So like I said, where Césaire tried to reimagine the chronology of liberation as process, Graham Du Bois highlights duration and direction. Progress which way challenges the myth of the forward march of history, the claim that America is always and continuously making satisfactory progress towards racial equality and full citizenship for Black people. The problem with a historical narrative that is constructed as a linear forward march, Graham Du Bois's essay suggests, is that this linearity is a myth that is wielded in the service of de-emphasizing human agency, as we saw with Kennedy's too fast, all in good time. Graham Du Bois refuses the language of tempered progress, too fast, that is undergirded by the implicit idea that liberation will eventually come because of the inevitability of the forward march of progress, right? All in good time suggests that there isn't that much that we need to do because inevitably we're going to get to a better, right, understood as a better sort of relation. By asking, therefore, progress which way, Graham Du Bois suggests that the production of history can code as a forward march that which is in effect movement backwards, away from liberation rather than towards it. And that's a lot of the conversation that we're having in this current political movement. Progress is not a given, an end to which we are inevitably propelled by the forward march of history, but rather the result of Black agency in revolution and in historical production. And so although how long does freedom take, there isn't really a direct answer in the essay, the fact that she chooses to ask that question and then go back to look at the American Revolution suggests that thinking about Black agency is the response to that question of the duration or the temporality of freedom. And so much like Suzanne Césaire, who turned to an international array of intellectual and artistic influences. So if you remember her letter to Bale, the different people that she pulls together in this constellation of thinkers, Shirley Graham Du Bois closes her essay with a poem by the Indian poet and musician Jan Niskar Akhtar, translated from Urdu. The poem's opening lines point us once again towards a reading of temporality, right? So you'll see in the opening lines there, the poem is entitled Immortal Link. A martyr's blood shed in space and time has always set the world ablaze, shaking the earth with burning tremors. These lines, used kind of to frame her discussion of the American Revolution, suggest resonances between the image of the martyr here and the Black Americans that are Graham Du Bois's protagonists in her essay. And so these lines drive home the idea that Black revolution is very much, Black agency in revolution is very much a question of negotiating territory and temporality, that the shedding of the martyr's blood happens in space and time. W.E.B. Du Bois's essay that followed Graham Du Bois's, titled Africa and the French Revolution, made the same argument, but on an international scale. So drawing heavily from C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, W.E.B. argues that people of African descent played a crucial role in the French Revolution, and that it is nearly impossible to understand the full scope and implications of the revolution without understanding France's imperial history, particularly its history in Haiti. Like Shirley, he shows what it would look like to center Black agency in world history. If the Du Bois's essays on Black agency and revolutions, American and French revolutions, are saying one thing, that there is the need to rewrite Black people back into existing Western canonical narratives of history, they are doing something much more radical. They are reimagining the very foundational elements of Western forms of knowledge, in this case, time. So how does W.B. Du Bois do that, right? We've seen how Shirley Graham Du Bois does that in her questioning of progress, in her questioning of linearity. What Du Bois does here is that his essay begins with a history of the French Revolution that is dominated by white actors. And then he pauses in the middle with the assertion, this is not the complete story. Let us go over the details again. And then he rewrites the very same revolution, but in a different way, this time with a focus on Haiti. The alternative vision of time that this essay enacts is one that keeps coming back on itself as it interrogates, reflects on, and attempts to redress not only the exclusions within the historical narrative, but the very fundamental notions of progress and liberation. Césaire and Graham Du Bois' examinations of liberation remain timely in a number of ways. On this occasion, reflecting on the life and legacy of W.B. Du Bois and his contributions to Black intellectual history, their interventions remind us to be attentive not only to the content of their work, but also to their work as action, as creation, as production. Their searing critiques of imperialism and their trenchant questions remain pertinent today. In our current political moment, we do not speak the same language, and progress which way highlight the necessity of new, or at the very least different, linguistic and temporal frameworks for thinking through and enacting liberation from imperialism. Thank you for your attention.
Elaborate on it because for I'm a visiting scholar and I'm working on the island of Hispaniola and with dance, significance of dance, and as where performance can be an act of resistance in itself. You said something about the twist, and I'm wondering is Suzanne there?
Yes.
What was her attitude about the dance? Is she from Martinique?
Yes.
What was her attitude about the significance of, for instance, of the ballet and the dance? In other words, did she mention that in her writings at all? The significance of dance in Martinique, and did she view it as a symbol of resistance in itself, the performance of it?
Right.
I don't know, because I know you said something about the twist.
Yes.
More like North America.
Right.
I hope I didn't get too complicated.
No, absolutely. This is a great question.
Yeah, performance.
Right.
As a symbol. Active.
Right. So I think that the question you're asking is asked in many different variations about Suzanne Césaire. What did she think about this thing? And it kind of gets us back to that photograph. It gets us back to the photograph where she's caught in mid-speech, right? So we know that but my suspicion is that Suzanne Césaire does have something to say about dance forms in Martinique. I guess we lost the photograph. Well, but we still have that sort of mental image, right? Is that Suzanne Césaire has something to say about cultural forms in Martinique, particularly because her play, Dawn of Liberty, is one that was written for public performance. And so that's part of why it hasn't survived, is that we have memories of the people who acted in that play, but we don't have the written text. But what Suzanne Césaire thought specifically about the ballet is not something she doesn't have any writings about that. So we don't have her direct words about what she thought about that. But we can infer some things from her choice of the twist, right? So I made the joke about kind of falling down the YouTube rabbit hole. I really did. I looked up the twist, and it's really fascinating because it went through a number of evolutions, right? So it sort of begins as this. Well, at some point in its lifespan, it's a performance, right? So you have the artist, Chubby Checker, I believe is his name, who is performing on stage to an entirely white audience. And he is dancing the twist, and they're all clapping politely, right? You have that kind of performance and consumption of dance. But Suzanne Césaire describes the twist here as recreating, not mimicry, but recreating the frenzy of African dance forms. So we move out of that dynamic of the performer on stage performing for consumption into really what we would describe as like a viral dance today, right? And she talks about the crossroads of the European cities. She is taking performance out of the sphere of production in the sense of consumption into really public spaces like the street. So when I read that portion of her letter, I really see people doing the twist at a traffic light, right? Right, is that because you have the image of the traffic stop, the intersection, the public space, and then she describes urban youth as the creators of the dance. So you can see here that her understanding of dance as cultural production is really also about Black agency in much the same way as Graham Du Bois is thinking about agency, right? So we're moving out of the language and the framework of dance as performance that is to be consumed by an audience that does not participate, right, beyond clapping, into dance that becomes something that is participatory. Whether she applies this reading of the twist to the ballet and other dance forms in Martinique, I'm not entirely sure, because she doesn't say anything directly about that. But this is what we can kind of infer from what she says of the twist.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I really loved your discussion of temporality with both thinkers. And so I have a question that you may have considered. If not, it's fine. Perhaps we can talk about it later on today. So I'm wondering how or whether alternative visions of time operating in Césaire and Graham Du Bois might link up with alternative visions of space. And in particular, thinking about Césaire, I'm thinking about some of the other essays in which she is articulating a Caribbean identity within a Black identity, right, and resituating Martinique within that American context, and not thinking about it solely in terms of its relationship to France, the colonizer. And then with Graham Du Bois, I'm thinking about, her re-examination of American revolutionary history, and in some ways it would seem to me that the act of centering Black agency within that history involves, as you noted, thinking about figures like Crispus Attucks, thinking about enslaved and free Black people in spaces in the United States, with their own designs or desires for liberation, and then finally thinking about the Du Bois essay, W.E.B. Du Bois essay, and his recentering of Black agency within French revolutionary history by saying we can't just focus on Europe, we also need to think about what's going on in Saint-Domingue. So again, and I'm sorry for all of that, but your talk was really generative. Do alternative visions of time link up in Césaire and Graham Du Bois with alternative visions of space?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that the poem that Graham Du Bois chooses, right, to kind of close that piece is one way that we can kind of begin to think about that question, right? So that the martyr's blood is shed in space and time, right? So that we're making that connection between space and time. I think that Suzanne Césaire's kind of alternative thinking of time also leads her to rethink space as home and as belonging. So I'm hesitating to use the word home, right? But she talks a lot about the island, but the island as an archipelago rather than the island as this kind of discrete single unit. And that comes, I think, from really shifting negritude thought away from the notion of roots, right? So that the linear kind of linear temporality asks us to look forward towards a future, or to think about progress, or to look back towards our roots, right? Our history, right? And so then you have that sort of ultimate singular root that is implanted in Africa as the point of deracination for people in the diaspora, specifically for Martinique. Suzanne Césaire has this really interesting image in one of her essays of the Antillean peasant who is standing with his toes rooted in the ground, right? And then she also talked about straddling an Afrique Antille, an Africa Antilles binary, right? So there we're looking at now the route that is going out in multiple directions that becomes a sort of precursor for thinkers like Edouard Glissant and others who are going to rethink both time and space in their concept of the rhizome as origin, right, rather than the root. So I think, yes, you're absolutely right that as you rethink what time looks like, right, you also rethink then where you're situated in relation to not just time but also spatially, and that situation now becomes multiple. I think that something similar is happening with Graham Du Bois and also with W.E.B. Du Bois's essay. So as you'll see, the title that I initially sent, and I kind of went back and forth on this a lot, is that I had in here Black Internationalist Visions of Liberation, right? And that's something that I'm still struggling to work through myself. But I think that that's part of what's happening here, is that the claims to space that Shirley Graham Du Bois's essay is making, in the same way that Du Bois's essay is making, those claims to space are at once located within the United States, but also asking that we think more internationally. And like I said, I'm struggling with the term international because it comes with a lot of baggage, right? But if you look at that entire issue of freedom ways, it begins with Graham Du Bois's essay about titled Negroes in the American Revolution, and then W.B. Du Bois writing about the French Revolution, and then the following essay is on the Cuban Revolution. So you have a kind of really broad international vision of liberation, and that to claim Black agency cannot be a local project uniquely. It has to be that in part, right? Because Graham Du Bois's examples are very specific, what is happening specifically in the United States. But the entirety of the issue is asking us, of the 1961 issue, is asking us to think also about these questions of how we rewrite canonical narratives of history in a more with a global scope. So whereas for Suzanne Césaire, it's getting us to question and rethink our ideas of origins and roots, I think that it's getting us to rethink the location of citizenship in Du Bois and Graham Du Bois's essays. Yes.
Also, thank you so much for your talk. Really wonderful. I've been thinking a bit about W.E.B. Du Bois and temporality. And your reflections on Césaire and Graham Du Bois spoke really interesting in some of these questions. I wonder if there's a tension between the temporality and age. That perhaps the story that you tell about Césaire is this project, cultural production, as a particular expression of time, the sense that Black people, this is a time of beginning, right? This time of creation, this time of mentality, beginning of time. Whereas, I'm not sure what you're saying about Graham Du Bois, because there's a way in which to question progress, and to question progress by way of telling the story about how African American intervention central this history is continually excluded, is to tell a story about time that doesn't move, perhaps, and at the end of the story of American progress. Perhaps it's too late. The freedom of Black folk in America, as Bois suggested in Reconstruction, right, is time for that is past. It's a time that America must be relative to Reconstruction. So, do you see, is there a tension there between these two?
Yeah, that is. So there's a lot to kind of unpack and unravel there. in terms of tensions in each writer's temporality, so for Suzanne Césaire, I don't read her conception of time or that moment of creation as a beginning. And I think that's partly because she uses the word to recreate, right? The frenzy of African dances, she says. So that moment contains at once the idea of emergence, the creation, the beginning, but also the idea that this is a recreation, right? That it is at once a return and something that is new. So coming from the Caribbean, particularly the Francophone Caribbean framework, I find that a lot of Caribbean intellectuals and artists use the image of the spiral very often to think about time, right? The way that time contains both cyclical qualities and forward movement. And I think that we can apply that also to Graham Du Bois and to W.E.B. Du Bois's essays here. Is that in one sense, yes, there is the sense that that beginning is no longer possible because the time for freedom has passed, i.e. it is too late. But I think that it is the time for America to make good on that vision of freedom that has passed. And so then we get to that moment of agency, right? That there is no more, I don't want to say necessarily counting on America, but that there is that need for, again, creation and recreation, right? That takes us to, again, the moment of Black agency in obtaining that liberation. So that there doesn't have to be a hope or optimism in America to make good on those promises, but that citizenship or that full citizenship can be claimed, right, through this act of rewriting for a Black internationalist audience, right? So for the audience of Freedom Ways that is thinking about America and France and Haiti and Cuba in that issue. So I mean, yes, there are absolutely tensions in the ways that each writer is thinking, and I think that some of those tensions come from negotiating the relationship between creation and recreation. Is that ultimately, how is this conception of time relating to what has come before, right? To a past that I think these visions of liberation are at once trying to claim, but also trying to sever ties with in a certain kind of way, right? And I think that, again, recreation kind of gets us to that fraught relationship of what does it mean to decry and distance oneself from the well-intentioned white liberals, is what Graham Du Bois characterizes them as, who have ultimately disappointed that vision of full citizenship, but to at the same time not therefore say, well, then this is the end of the road, this is the end of time for us, right? But essentially to say, in what ways then can we recreate something new that is also building on that which we're trying to sever ourselves from? So that's, I think, where the tension comes in. But I do want to emphasize recreation rather than the notion of a complete beginning, because I think that's one of the ways that Suzanne Césaire is particularly valuable in helping us to think about the relationship to the past in ways that hasn't always been the case when people have thought about negritude, for example. Yes.
And I'll make this as brief as possible, since it goes with these other questions. So I love what you were doing about thinking about the duration of Black agency rather than the sort of spectacularity of the current crisis, right, or the present moment. And I'm wondering how or if you might fit that or Césaire or Du Bois into a sort of Black feminist intellectual tradition. If you would, if you see this as with that, against that, if you would position them in there, and if not, why not? So just sort of how you might think about this within a kind of Black feminist one.
Okay, so how I would fit the notion of the duration of Black agency in a Black feminist intellectual tradition. The first question is, would I? And that's a great question, because there are many ways that I'm always very hesitant to fit even Suzanne Césaire into these traditions, because all of these thinkers don't always correspond to some of the fundamental tenets or ideals of Black feminism. But I think that the question of duration is an important one. I want to emphasize that I hear in that question frustration, right? No, not in your question. In Graham Du Bois's question, how long? No, right. No, let me rephrase that. I hear in the question that Du Bois is asking that gets us to duration, right? Just how long does freedom take, right? Beyond the kind of abstract intellectual, ruminations on time, etc. I hear genuine frustration, right? And I hear that question constantly still today, right? The idea of how far we have come, but really not at all, etc. Right? So I want to emphasize that hearing that frustration, I think, is one of the ways that I would possibly fit that essay or those ideas of duration into a Black feminist intellectual tradition, is being able to name that frustration, right? If you think about, like, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? Like, you have the idea that one needs to be able to articulate that which is not working and the impact on oneself. And that is something that may not be unique to Black feminist thought, but it's certainly central to Black feminist thought. So something that I didn't mention is that the direction that I'm going in with Suzanne Césaire and a number of Black Caribbean women writers is to think about the impact of racism and imperialism on their health. And the more I think about it, the longer the list gets, which is really startling, right? And the ways that then that impact is reflected in their writings as urgency and as interruption. And so I see that kind of those dual notions of urgency and interruption being articulated in the frustration that comes with the question, just how long does liberation take? But beyond that, I would hesitate to go any further, particularly with Du Bois, but also with Graham Du Bois herself and with Suzanne Césaire, any further into Black feminist tradition to situate them in there, but to say that that moment of frustration, I think, is one that resonates a lot with that tradition. Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank our guests.